I've only done one of these kinds of conferences before, and I won't say the name of it, but it was in Northern California. And the theme of that conference was happiness. And so I talked about a man who's a great hero of mine, Howard Moskowitz, who is the man who invented chunky tomato sauce, because I thought that he could reasonably be said to have contributed as much to American happiness as anyone else. And when I was finished, people gave me a very sort of disappointed look, because I think they had expected me to talk about the cosmos or something far grander. So I've resolved this time around not to disappoint people and to talk about something a lot more meaningful than the man who invented chunky tomato sauce. And so I've decided to talk about office chairs. In particular, I decided to talk about what office chairs tell us, of course, about human nature. This is taken in part from a chapter of my new book, which is called Blink and is coming out in January, and which I hope you all buy in triplicate. It's a book about rapid cognition, about thin slicing and first impressions and stuff. And I assure you that it's entertaining, even on those occasions when it's wrong. The story I want to tell begins with a man named Bill Stumpf. And Bill Stumpf is a chair designer. And in the world of chairs, Bill Stumpf is a very, very big deal. And he's from Minneapolis. And he was famous, first of all, for two very, very well-known chairs from the 1970s and the 1980s, the Ergon and the Equa. And they really set the standard for what an office chair is all about. But he decided he wanted to go one step further, and he wanted to create the greatest office chair of all time. And so he got together with Herman Miller, and they put their heads together, and they said, let's produce a chair that, unlike any other chair that's ever been made. So he sat down, he decided this has to be the most comfortable. That was really the goal, to make a chair that you could sit in happily all day. So he spends a lot of time working on the back of the chair, because the back is really the part that really matters in a chair. And he contoured the back in this very, very unusual way that produced a lot more support for your shoulders. And then he also did all kinds of interesting things. He realized he wanted fully adjustable arms, and it's far easier to adjust the arms on a chair if you attach the arms to the back of the chair and not to what they call the seat pan, which is what every other chair does. So he did this very unusual thing of attaching and then he worked for a long time on the relationship, the hinge, that connects the seat pan to the back, because normally there's a very, very normal hinge, and when you go back and forth in a chair like this, it pulls your shirt out of the back of your pants, right? Because as you move back on the back, the seat pan moves out. So he designed this extraordinarily complex hinge that allowed these two parts of the chair to move independently, which actually makes an enormous difference in the comfort of a chair. And then he realized that one of the other big issues with chairs is that they're hot. That's one of the reasons chairs get uncomfortable, right? Because they're made of this kind of cloth or some kind of fabric, and it doesn't really breathe. And so he decided that what he would do is he would use mesh. And no one had ever made an office chair out of mesh before. In fact, no one really knew how to make mesh that would work in an office chair. And he spent an enormous amount of time working with the engineers at Herman Miller, because if you think about it, if you have mesh, the big issue with mesh is that when you compress mesh, rather when you expand mesh, and then you get up, it'll pinch, right? So they had to come up with mesh that didn't pinch. And believe me, that's an extraordinarily difficult engineering task. And they spent all kinds of money coming up with this really wonderful mesh that was breathable and at the same time didn't pinch your skin when you moved around on it. So in the early 90s, finally he sort of had something that was workable, and he goes to Herman Miller, and they put together these prototypes. And they're pretty raw in the early stages, but they start taking them out to show people. And in the chair world, you use two measures to test a chair, and they're very simple. One is a comfort measure, scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is, the most comfortable thing you've ever sat on, and 1 is, a lumpy ground. And then you also have a scale of 1 to 10 on aesthetics. How beautiful do you think it is? And the general rule of thumb in the chair world is that you have to have high scores on both measures to have a successful chair. Right? People will not buy something that's beautiful and uncomfortable, and they will not buy something that's comfortable and ugly. You got to do both. So they took this chair around, and within a couple of years, they were getting really good comfort scores. They start low, but finally they're getting around 8s on comfort, which is amazing. If you have a chair that scores an 8, it's about as high as chairs usually get, or actually higher. Most office chairs are 6, 5, 7. But the bad news was that when they did aesthetic scores on this new chair, they got scores that were unbelievably low, 2s, 3s, 4s. And that's incredibly unusual because usually there's some correlation between these two things. That people will adjust their view in a certain way if it's comfortable, and they'll say, well, actually, I don't mind the way it looks. But there was no correlation here. It was actually quite scary. This thing was considered absolutely hideous. And so they got a little word, and they worked on it a little further, and they got to where they had a prototype that was pretty close to go to market. So they said, well, let's take it out for one more round of kind of focus groups and market testing. And the first thing people they brought in were the designers, the people who they thought would be the most accepting of something that was sort of new and radical. Because remember, this chair looked quite different from any other chair that people had ever. It was mesh, it had this weird-looking back, it had this massive hinge underneath the seat pan that worked this complex mechanism. So they took it out to the designers, and designers looked at it and were really, really lukewarm, which is a very, very bad sign when your most kind of edgy and forward audience is a little bit upset. And then they said, well, they swallowed hard, and they took it to the facility managers. And facility managers in the chair business are the people who make and break your product. They're the ones who will order 500 chairs for a new corporate headquarters. They must be on board for your chair to work. They take it to the facility managers, and the facility managers hated it. I actually looked at some of the focus group reports that came out of it, and people were absolutely unsparing. They said it looked like lawn furniture. Someone else said it looked like something from the set of RoboCop, which was a big movie at the time. There was another one where the people said, a very, very senior, important facility manager said, I like it, but why don't you come back and show me this chair when you've finished with the chair? And they were like, you don't understand. This is the finished chair. So in other words, it was this kind of really terrifying moment. They'd spent millions and millions of dollars coming up with this brand new chair, and nobody likes it. Now, this kind of thing happens all the time, not just in the chair world, but in the world as a whole, right? Not all good ideas work, or not all ideas that we think are good work. Some fail, right? And we accept that that's the price of doing business in the world. But here's the catch, and that is that the chair that everybody said they hated is the Aeron chair. And the Aeron chair is something I'm sure you're all familiar with. It is this extraordinary, incredibly now popular chair. It is, in fact, the best-selling chair in the history of chairs. So that was the sort of puzzle. And when people said they thought it was ugly, it turns out that they actually didn't think it was ugly. That when they took the chair out, after a couple months, people started to warm up to it. After about a year or so, it began to win design awards. After about 2 years or so, it started being shown in commercials and movies, and all kinds of designers and people out in Silicon Valley began to love this chair. And then the sales curve started climbing and climbing and climbing and climbing. And after about 4 years, it was the biggest selling product in Herman Miller's history, and now it is the most successful office chair of all time. And then they went back, after it became the biggest selling office chair of all time. They took the chair around to the same focus groups they'd asked before, and they said, can you rate this chair on a score of 1 to 10 on aesthetics? And all of a sudden, it started to get 8s and 9s. What people had said initially that they thought was ugly, they now said was absolutely beautiful. Now, I think you'll agree with me that the story of the Aeron chair creates a big problem. And the problem is that we're in our society, we spend a lot of time trying to come up with things that people like, right? We are, in fact, a society that's in the business of coming up with ideas and products and notions and systems that people like. And how do we find out what people like? Well, we find out by asking them, right? How else would you find out what people like? And people are always really happy to tell us what they like and what they think or what they're thinking. Right? That's the way the system works. But the story of the Aeron chair suggests that somewhere in that transaction, there is a problem. And the problem is that there is something that's being lost between the expression of a preference and the feeling of a preference. Because here you have some people who said that they absolutely hated this thing, this new chair, when in fact they actually loved it. In fact, they were 2 years away from, or 3 years away from making it the best-selling chair of all time. And had Herman Miller done what people are supposed to do in this situation, to listen closely about what people said they wanted and give them what they wanted, they would have missed out on the biggest selling product in the history of their company. Right? So this is my question. Why would people say they didn't like a new idea that they actually liked? And what does the fact that people in this case are so hopelessly out of touch with their own feelings and thoughts and preferences tell us about human nature? I think there's several. There's a couple of lessons that I think we can draw from this story, and I want to walk through them one by one. And the first lesson, and the sort of most obvious lesson of that, is that preference, our feelings about something, are extraordinarily unstable. People think that the act or state of liking or disliking something is firm, right? I like spaghetti, I don't like ravioli, right? And we think of that as a kind of, you could take me to Italy and I'm still not going to like the ravioli. That's something that's part of who I am. That's the way we think about our preferences. But what this story says is that actually, no, our preferences are extraordinarily unstable. Now, I think that's an obvious point, but I think it's worth working through it because there's all kinds of interesting dimensions to it. But let me give you an example of what happened when this principle is forgotten. Everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with the story of New Coke, the Coke disaster from the 1980s. And the reason they got into that problem was that Pepsi came along and started doing blind taste tests. And a blind taste test is a very simple thing. That you take a glass, and you put some Coke in it, and you put some Pepsi in it, right? And you give the person the two glasses, and you say, without telling them which one is which one do you prefer? Right? And they taste them. What they did in the Pepsi challenge was that they would taste them, the first one, and they would say, ooh, I really like that. They would taste the second one, and they say, ooh, I hate that. And the first one was always Pepsi, right? That was the whole point about the Pepsi challenge. And Pepsi ran these commercials all around the country saying, when you give people a blind taste test, they always prefer Pepsi. And this inspired panic at Coke, right? Here was this company that was the greatest soft drink company of all time, and they were failing what seemed like an extraordinarily objective measure of people's preferences. So what did Coke do? Well, they went back into the lab and they said, we have to respond to this. This is a complete blow to our company and what we stand for. So they came out with a new product, which they thought would do better at this. It was more like Pepsi, a little lighter, a little sweeter. And they ran this new product through all kinds of blind taste tests. And sure enough, they began to do much better with this new product. And in fact, they did hundreds of thousands of these blind taste tests around the country. And they were beating Pepsi by, I think, 55 to 45, which is an extraordinary measure. And so they brought out this new product, called it New Coke, and they stood up there, the CEO of Coke, and said, I have never been sure of a decision in my life than the decision that New Coke is going to beat old Coke, right? Why wouldn't you be sure? You did 100,000 taste tests of this. Preference is stable. Well, we all know what happened, and that was preference wasn't stable. People didn't like this new product. They confirmed through the most objective measures that people preferred New Coke to Pepsi, and that turned out to be false. Now, why is it false? If you go and anyone who went to business school, I'm sure you studied this as a case study, and they go on and on about marketing issues and this and that and the other. But at the root of the failure of Coke was something very simple, and that is that what we think of as a really good way, objective measure of telling whether someone prefers one drink to another isn't very good at all. There are all kinds of subtle flaws to the blind taste test. The first flaw is that there's something wrong with a sip. I could let's do this. Put a little Coke in here, a little Pepsi in here, a little Coke in here. Now, which one do you prefer? What people do is they go like this. Ooh, I like that. No, I think I prefer it, right? Looks subjective? It's not. Why? Because you're only taking a sip. If you only take a sip of something, you will almost always prefer the drink that's sweeter. Right? If you drink the whole can, your preference will shift and you'll prefer the thing that's not so sweet, because sweetness becomes cloying when you're forced to drink more and more of this. Pepsi understood this. They had the sweeter drink. So what did they do? Did they give people a whole can to drink and say, which do you prefer? Oh, no. They went out to the malls of America and sat down and put this much in the bottom of every cup and said, just take a sip and tell us which one you prefer. Right? Use another kind of testing that people in the drinks business use. It's called home use, and that is I give you the whole can. In fact, I give you 2 cases, and I say, go home with these 2 cases, drink it for 3 weeks, and tell me which one you prefer. And the thing about home use tests is they invariably come up with a different answer than sip tests. If you have someone experience something a different way, they'll come to a profoundly different conclusion. There's actually a great test you can do to show how unstable people's preferences are, and it's called the triangle test. And the triangle test is very simple. It's simply this. Now pretend you didn't see that. I give you 3 glasses, not 2. I mix them up here so you don't know which is which. And I say, I'd like you to drink all those 3, and I'd like you, first of all, we're going to start with 2. One is Coke and one is Pepsi. I simply would like you to drink one, drink the other, tell me which is Coke and which is Pepsi. Right? I suspect that all of you in this room can do that. It's actually quite easy. Probably 80% of you can tell which is Coke and which is Pepsi if you're familiar with those 2 drinks. And then I say, all right, I'm going to give you a little wrinkle. I'm going to give you 3. And this time, I don't want to know which is Coke and which is Pepsi. I simply want to know which one is unlike the other 2. Sound easy? Totally not. That if we did this test in this room right now, the success rate in successfully telling which one of these is Coke, remember 2 are Pepsi, 1 is Coke, the success rate in this room would be 33%. It would be chance. By simply forcing you to drink a third cup, take a third sip, I completely derail your system of establishing preference or your system of making decision making. A little simple step causes all of that, the brilliance of your that's Coke and that's Pepsi, to be erased. And that's a really, I think, important step because it says that the difference between being able to successfully navigate a choice and being incapable of navigating their choice is 1 sip. That's all it takes. This is an extraordinarily unstable system. We think it isn't, but it is. So that's lesson number 1. People say they don't like the air-on. Why would we believe them? Preference can change by adding one little, I can change your mind about Coke by Pepsi by making you drink a whole can instead of taking a sip. Why would we believe just that someone actually doesn't like the air-on just because they said they didn't like the air-on, right? Okay, let's dig a little deeper. There's a second lesson in this which is a little more serious. And that is that when consumers or people tell you what they think about a new idea, very often they're just making up stories. Now there's a great deal of research on this, but there's a wonderful experiment that was done back in the 20s, which is a beautiful illustration of this. A guy named Norman Maier did this. He brings people into a room, and in this room he's got 2 long ropes hanging from the ceiling, right? And they're separated they're far enough apart that you cannot, by holding one rope and walking over, reach the second rope. And in the room there's all kinds of objects. And he says, what I would like you to do is come up with as many ways as possible of connecting these 2 ropes, right, of simultaneously holding both ropes. And he said, there are, in fact, 4 ways of doing this. And what people do is they look around the room, and the first thing they do is they take one rope, they bring it over, and they tie it to right here, right? And then they go over, grab the other rope, bring it over, and connect them. Then they look around, and they see that there's a pole in the corner. So they grab one rope, and they could put the pole in the other hand, and they use the pole to pull the second rope towards them. Then they see that there's a clothesline. And they go, aha, a clothesline. And they take the clothesline, and they tie it to the end of one rope, and they use it, and they connect both ropes. And then they're stuck. Invariably, people do those first 3, and then they sit there and they go, I can't think of another one. Is there really another way? Right? And at that point in the experiment, Norman Maier would walk by one of the ropes and casually brush it with his shoulder. Right? Now the rope is swaying. And at that point, everyone would say, oh, I know. And they would tie an object, a heavy object, to the end of one rope, start swaying it back and forth like a pendulum, grab this first rope, come over, and attach them. And then he would say, where did you get the idea for swaying that rope like a pendulum? And they would say, I had this sudden thought about physics class back in grade 10. Or they would say, for some reason, I have no idea why, I began thinking about a monkey in a jungle and how a monkey swings on a vine and... No one ever said, I got the idea because you put the rope in motion, right? You hit it with your shoulder. Now, are they lying? Right? Are they ashamed that they couldn't get it on their own? No, they're not lying. The problem is that they picked up that cue unconsciously. And we don't have access to our unconscious. We don't know what these things are coming, where they're coming from, that bubble up from the recesses of our brain. So what do? Well, we have a behavior that we just did. We just made a decision of a certain kind. We don't really know where it came from. So we come up with an explanation. We make up a story. And we're really good at making up stories. Now, I call this the storytelling problem. And this is something that happens over and over and over again. I spent time when I was writing my book with this tennis coach named Vic Braden. And he spent a lot of time talking to world-class tennis players. And one of the things he noticed is that if you ask a world-class tennis player how he hits a topspin forehand, they will always say that this, and they say, well, then, right at the moment of impact, I roll my wrist, right? This. Well, Vic Braden took videotapes of world-class tennis players hitting topspin forehands and digitized them and broke them down to, milliseconds, and noticed that no one ever rolled their wrist when they hit the ball, ever. The wrist was always fixed. In fact, if you roll your wrist when you hit the ball, you can't hit a good topspin forehand. Yet all these guys were going around the country giving seminars, teaching young kids how to hit topspin forehands and saying, at the critical moment of impact, you got to roll your wrist just like that. They had no idea. These are people who hit a topspin forehand better than anyone else in human history, and yet they are fundamentally incapable of accurately describing the way in which they perform that task. And when they're asked to describe it, what do? They tell a story. Now, this is a real problem, because what it says is that our whole assumption of this project is that we can ask people to explain what they're feeling. But then when we look at various situations, we say that when we listen to these stories people tell about why they think the way they do or what they want, they bear no connection to reality. Right? They're just plucking them out of thin air. Problem number 3, and I think this is the most serious problem of all, and that is that asking people to think about what they want causes them to change their opinion of what they want. In fact, it screws up their ability to understand and recognize what they want. This problem in psychology is called the perils of introspection problem. And a lot of the research has been done by a guy named Tim Wilson at UVA. And he once did this very simple experiment called the poster test. And the poster test is, you got a bunch of posters in a room, you bring some college students in, you say, pick any poster you want, take it home. They do that. Second group is brought in, you say, pick any poster you want, tell me why you want it, and then go home, right? A couple months passes, and he calls up all the students, and he says, that poster you got a couple months back, do you like it? And the kids who, in the first group, who didn't have to explain their choice, all liked their poster. And the kids in the second group, who did have to explain, then now they hate their poster. And not only that, the kids who had to explain their poster picked a very different kind of poster than the kids who didn't have to explain their poster. So making people explain what they want changes their preference, and changes their preference in a negative way. It causes them to gravitate towards something they actually weren't interested in the first place. Now, there's a wonderful little detail in this, that there were 2 kinds of posters in the room. There were these impressionist prints, and then there were these photos of, kittens hanging on bars that said, hang in there, baby. And the students who were asked to explain their preference overwhelmingly chose the kitten. And the ones who weren't asked to explain overwhelmingly chose the impressionist poster. Now, and they were happy with their choice, obviously. Who could be happy with the kitten on their wall after 3 months? Now, why is that? Why, when you ask someone to explain their preference, do they gravitate towards the least sophisticated of the offerings? Because it's a language problem, right? You're someone, you know that in your heart, that you prefer the impressionist, but now you have to come up with a reason for your choice. And you don't really have the language to say why you like the impressionist photo. What you do have the language for is to say, well, I like the kitten because I had a kitten when I was growing up, and So forcing you to explain something when you don't necessarily have the vocabulary and the tools to explain your preference automatically shifts you towards the most conservative and the least sophisticated choice. Now, you see this time and time again in, for example, market research, that the act of getting someone in a room and asking them to explain their preference causes them to move away from the more sophisticated, more daring, more radical idea. A classic example is All in the Family. When the first pilot was made back in the 70s, it was taken to ABC, and ABC had a big room full of the people, many people as this. They showed them the test, and they asked them to rate the pilot, asked them to rate it on a scale of 1 to 100. You need 70 to get on the air, basically. This All in the Family pilot got 40, an unbelievably low score. And the comments were, well, the real problem is Archie Bunker. He needs to be a little softer, more nurturing, more of a caring father. Right? Was people's response. So what did ABC do? They passed on it. Right? Guys went to CBS. CBS tested it, did really poorly, but some guy at the top of CBS really liked it. So they thought, well, why not? I'm going to just play it. So they put it on the air, and it was one of the most lucrative sitcom franchises in the history of television. Right? So what does this mean? Does this mean we can't trust people at all? Maybe. What it really means, though, is that there is a class of products that are difficult for people to interpret. Right? Some things really are ugly, and when we say that they're ugly, they really are ugly, and we're always going to think they're ugly, right? They're never going to be beautiful. But there's another class of products which we see, and we don't really know what we think. They challenge us. We don't know how to describe them. And we end up, if we're forced to explain ourselves, in calling them ugly, because we can't think of a better way to describe our feelings. And the real problem with asking people what they think about something is that we don't have a good way of distinguishing between these two states. We don't have a good way of distinguishing between the thing that really is ugly and the thing that is radical and challenging and simply new and unusual. Right? And so often when we use the evidence of what people say to determine what we ought to do or what we ought to go forward, we end up throwing out not just the things that ought to be thrown out, but the very things that are most meaningful and have the potential to be most revolutionary. There are, I think, sort of two important lessons in that. The first is the one I dwell on in my book, and which is simply that because of this fact, people who come up with new ideas or new products or radical new things need to be very careful in how they interpret the evidence of consumers, of the people that they ask about it, of random people whose opinions they seek. That we need to be very skeptical of no, and very skeptical of ugly, and very skeptical of I don't like that, particularly when we're dealing with something that is radical and in some way challenging and difficult for someone to completely explain their feelings about. That's one implication. But the second implication, which is really one that's more relevant to this discussion here, is that we've gotten really, really good in recent years at describing all kinds of things about the way people, the way human beings work and the way the mind operates, right? We understand genetics, we understand physiology, we have a whole vast array of knowledge now about why we do the things we do. But there is one area, perhaps the most important area at all, where we remain really, really bad, and that is interpreting the contents of our own hearts. And as we go forward and learn more and more about human beings, I think we need to remember this fact and to be humble, because I'm not sure this is a mystery that we're ever going to solve.